You entered Parliament as the youngest woman in Australia at the age of 26, I should say. That's 27 years ago. Since then, and in particular throughout the course of last year, we really had the spotlight being shown on some of these issues, the deeply entrenched challenges at really the crux of leadership, power and gender in the country. What's changed in that time that you were in Parliament, and what needs to change?
Well, clearly there have been some changes in that while I may be the youngest woman to ever enter the federal parliament, and thanks for acknowledging it's a long time ago, there has been an increase in numbers, but the rate and the pace of change has been so slow. You wouldn't believe it, but in Australia, we still haven't got gender parity in our parliaments. We certainly don't have the diversity and difference of Australian women reflected and represented in our parliaments. And we have a culture that, as you say, has been exposed for being a little outdated, archaic, and certainly toxic in some respects when you're dealing with allegations of sexual assault, harassment and sexism. But certainly women in public life and in Parliament specifically in Australia are still subject to quite ridiculous double standards and stereotypes. And I'm just very keen for that to change.
How do you appeal to talented young people, talented young women to be part of the political class when you take a look at things that have happened to the likes of Brittany Higgins?
Well, on the one hand, we have research and surveys that tell us that young women in particular don't want a bar of politics. And my message to them, if you are appealing to them, is don't give up on politics just because you feel that the political system's given up on you. And I feel quite heartened in recent months, in fact, in the last year or so, which we describe as a bit of a reckoning in terms of gender politics in Australian life, that while these stereotypes and harassment and this sexism is not new, what is new are younger people generally, but women especially, calling out this bad behaviour, challenging it, taking it on. So that's a big difference from my time where you were completely isolated if you did draw attention to bad behaviour or certainly culture that was sexist or inappropriate. So yes, I think there is some change afoot and I'm heartened by that.
When you talk about culture, are you talking about the culture of politics in Australia that's the problem, or how much of the issue is also with the broader Australian culture?
That's a really good question, because I think obviously leadership comes from our top institutions, our decision-making institutions, including our federal parliament. And if gender equality is not embedded in the DNA of those institutions, you know, if our leaders, such as our Prime Minister, are not modelling respectful, ethical, equal relationships in that context, of course that sends a message to the broader community. But I would suggest that actually there are some institutions in Australian life, including corporate Australia, including sport, where you're actually seeing much more progress when it comes to diversity and inclusion and certainly gender equality than perhaps some of those institutions like our parliament. So I think there's a lot of community change and it has to be whole of population change, but I'm heartened that some of this is taking place. I just wish it was faster in our parliament, and key to that, of course, is equal and diverse representation. And at the moment, when you have around a third of the Australian federal parliament female, that's not good enough, especially for a country that granted the right to vote in 1902 to most women, excluding Indigenous women, unfortunately. So the rate of change is so slow.
Still, you talk about how women are more willing to call out bad behavior. How important will gender equality be in this election?
Oh, fundamental. And look, I'm not putting the onus on women to call it out. Obviously, we need men, particularly men with power, to be a part of this change. But gender politics generally, I guess in a policy sense, but also the votes of women particularly, I think will have a really important impact on this election. We've already seen votes for the coalition, so the party in power, declining when it comes to women's support. And I'm starting to see a bit of an interest, almost a bidding war, for lack of a better term, on women's particular policies that affect women, such as the prevention of violence against women and children, the issue of childcare, hopefully early education, hopefully paid parental leave. So you'll see that they will have a policy role, but also women's vote's going to matter. And there's a rising tide of female independent candidates, which says something about our political system too.
Yeah, the rise of the independents has been quite extraordinary going into this election. You talk about the policy inducements. We saw that with the so-called women's budget announced by the government over the past few days. Is that package of policy inducements enough to capture the women's vote?
No, I think what it symbolises is an acknowledgement that there's a problem. And certainly these are small steps, but while we still define parental leave or childcare as women's business or problem, we do have some fundamental difficulties. I do think those inducements are just a small step. And I do think the election campaign, you will see a greater emphasis. I think any party that doesn't place that kind of emphasis on the issues affecting women particularly, I think will suffer as a consequence. But it's not just about the policies, it's about the cultural change, and that relies on more women running and being reflected and represented in those decision-making institutions. The party that gets that right, I think, will have an added advantage, or at least I hope they will.
So part of the problem when it comes to the culture of leadership has not just been access, it's been about the culture, it's been about the privilege that is sort of, provided to white male politicians in particular. In your experience, how would you frame the role of allyship in terms of getting more representation to the very top?
Fundamentally important. As I say, this is not women's business. This is everybody's problem, whether it's the broader issue of gender equality or, in fact, people getting into Parliament and other institutions. But that means people have to relinquish power. We've learnt that from around the world. If you want to ensure equality of access, then some people have to share power or indeed step down. And we keep replacing some of those usually white, male, middle-class politicians with the same. And that's a pretty conscious bias, I think. And I'm very concerned that we haven't seen more politicians who are exiting Parliament ensuring that their particular seat is going to be filled by someone who is different and diverse and doesn't necessarily reflect the same background and experiences and indeed privilege that they have. So I'm hoping that will be something we see in greater numbers at the next federal election.